Hello again for the third time. I'm Sheikh Jalal Ahmed, and continuing with the ride harmony concepts. How do factory suspensions, aftermarket suspensions work? You've already watched hopefully the first two videos talking about the commonalities that essentially all factory suspensions share, whether it's yes, they usually have flat ride, meaning a higher rear frequency than the front in terms of the oscillation, but that's only sometimes because of the interactions with the bump stops and the shock damping that pulls them in via NASCAR style rebound bias, especially in the front. So the initial frequencies that might give you flat ride, the front being a little bit lower than the rear, once this interaction happens, these first three elements, especially these first three, which is designed to be safe, understeer, the car goes off the road in a straight line rather than goes off spinning, because a driver would likely blame the manufacturer for a car that is rotating, even though most enthusiasts would be okay with that. But so this is the first three behaviors, the first three elements here that create this switch from flat ride into pitch, which is that seesaw teeter-totter. And pitch feels very sporty, it's busy, but the tires are being jerked, they're being abused, and you're being abused. So it's almost like legal abuse, you could call it that, because you wouldn't tolerate if you're sitting in your chair at home or sitting, if you're on an airplane. And I made this analogy when I'm working on a book, I've been working on it for a while, and I kind of opened up the first chapter to say, imagine you're in a comfortable chair, and then all of a sudden you feel a jolt, but then you go back to sleep, but then you feel another jolt, and it's a bigger one this time, and then all of a sudden maybe you're gripping the seats, the handle or the arm rests of your chair, and you realize you're not at home on your lazy boy. You're in a plane and you're in the air 30,000 feet up without a parachute, and you're hoping and praying to God that nothing's going to happen that's going to prevent you from getting down to the ground safely. I mean, obviously there's been accidents. I have a guilty pleasure, or just it's like a morbid fascination watching airplane crashes. Mentor Pilot is a wonderful channel, and they actually analyze all the things that go on to cause that accident to have happened. And in many, many cases, it's very preventable. There's very, very few freak things that weren't related to some maintenance issue or some oversight or some assumption somebody made. We didn't run this checklist. We didn't document this. Oh, I thought somebody else changed that. And in a way, that the parallel of, you wouldn't be happy to have an extremely jerky plane flight. If every single plane flight you took had horrible turbulence, you might find ways to avoid doing that, because it's just very disorienting. And bad things can also happen. But we put up with it in cars often because we think, oh, we're on the ground. It's almost like not even a question that this is something that you need to object to. I was speaking to a gentleman. I'm just going to mention this third video is I'm reflecting back on the previous two, and my intention is to kind of put things together in a bit of a summary, and to also share a few more personal reflections in this video. So I'm not going to say you have to watch this, but after usually about 15, 20, 30 minutes of a phone consult when I do with somebody, because again, my intention is doing these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or so videos, to at least have the first two, maybe the last two, be very targeted to what I would want to communicate, so that somebody understands my, the FCM Elite, the ride harmony approach. When I talk about what the different stages are and the way that I design, and the way I pick the spring frequencies, how I choose the spring rates, and make sure the bump stops are small but present, that the front spring versus the rear, or the front frequency, more correctly, the front frequency is lower than the rear to get this beautiful cancellation effect, this harmony. The idea of what's dominating, which is in the Fat Cat setup, the rear spring dominates. In the factory setups, the front bump stop dominates. And that's a really important thing to be aware of. So this overview that I'm giving is to help understand why I would say you want to use a stiffer rear spring or higher rear frequency, why I talk about frequencies, why you need to talk to a potential suspension vendor and ask them, does your suspension create flat ride? I mean, the factory has it, again, sometimes, but they could choose to keep flat ride if they wanted, except they might need to use either a bigger front bar. They might need to assume that the drivers are not going to be complete idiots, so if the car does actually become a bit more neutral rather than constant understeer, that they can just, you have to know how to control it. Or you leave your traction control on so that the car handles itself. It's been wet here, and so it's wet enough that I need to leave the traction control on because my car is playful, and in the dry it's awesome, but in the wet, without aids, it can be more of a handful. So you just need to be judicious. And I talked about the first three, and then this element of the high gas force, and I didn't really touch on it in the first two videos, but a lot of even companies that use Bilstein, monotube, it could be Bilstein, it could be the ND Miata, the 4th gen Miata from 2016 now to 2024 and on. Those dampers have high gas force in them, which has really been shocking to me. Why the Miata dampers? Because those are inboard mounted. They're not a strut. They don't have to generate as much. Well, they have to generate a decent amount of force, but they've been over pressurized from what I've seen. And so there's a lot of chatter. I made a video, which I'll likely link, to Dina Kelly, who had a 2016 Miata we tuned for SCCA Autocross, Sports Car Club of America, and street class. So we couldn't change more than just the shocks, bump stops, front, one sway bar, we changed the front. And she talked about how the factory suspension skeetered. It was like a skeetering lizard is what she was describing. And she essentially was talking about what this gas force was, because it was causing the car to jerk, to be unstable, even though it had fairly soft springs. It was soft. I mean, the bump stops were doing their thing, but the gas force was creating this vibration, and I call it like a hidden gremlin. It's like you can never find the source of it unless you drill down. You can get flat ride, you can get the damping tuned well, you can do rally car damping, but if you don't get the gas force low enough, you're going to always have this vibration that's going to be very unsettling. It's not as dramatic as having major turbulence, but it's like a background turbulence, you can call it. That's also why I want to talk about the ripple reducer, which I hope the camera is able to zoom in on that well enough. That this ripple reducer is giving this filtering. So it's like somebody's gone and sanded the road down. People have described it as that. And in fact, I can link to a testimonial of a individual, Tom, who's an autocrosser, who also drives his Miata on the street. And he went from a setup that initially it did have flat ride, but I was using a bit more NASCAR damping. And it was a bit more rebound bias damping. And I was just in the process of inventing or discovering and then applying the drilled holes in the piston. And so he actually was the person that got me convinced that I needed to get this out and actually need to make it mandatory, which is why I said stage 2 and stage 3 are, stage 2 has ripple reducer and stage 3 includes stage 2 and then adds the multi-stage tarmac, all the super awesomeness that I can put in. So he was happy with the setup, even though there was a NASCAR bias in terms of rebound, but it had flat ride, it had reasonable gas force, but there was a jacking down bias, and there was no frequency filtering yet. So I said, hey, I'll do this upgrade for you for free as long as you give an honest assessment to people of what this was like for you. And so he's like, sure, I'll do it. So he put this review on Miata. Said, I just want your honest opinion. I mean, I had a feeling he was going to be happy, and then he was just very, very, very pleased. And again, it's a very worthwhile link, so I will make a reference to that. And it was just purely his comments. So I think I've spoken enough about what I have on the board right now. What I want to touch on now, and then what I want to talk about as more of a reflection. So this is now what are we into 10 minutes, just not 10 minutes. Is I wrote down here, may not be very visible, so let me make this a bit clearer. It's right on top of it. What? Maybe it won't be even less clear, but who knows? Who knows? And this idea of what dominates, meaning what are you predominantly feeling in terms of how the car is reacting to the road, responding, like what, in any type of dynamic relationship, whoever's the more active person tends to get the spotlight more, right? Whoever that happens to be. And so the person who's more calm and cool kind of observes, and the person who's more outgoing does their thing. And so that's often a dynamic that we find in families of all kinds, right? Or friendships, whatever the case is. And so in the suspension world, in your vehicle suspension, you've got springs, you've got shocks, struts, shocks. I'm going to grab a glove this time. You've got bump stops, right? You've got all these little components that are. You've got the sway bar, which I have somewhere. I have a bar somewhere. It's a metal. I said triangular last time. It's a rectangular piece of metal bar, right? So you've got those things. You've got the suspension linkages too. But in terms of what are we focusing on changing, and how are we trying to get these to interact in a harmonious way? And so the factory, again, I believe intentionally and for reasonable cause, they design something that's mass market, but it makes the front end and the front bump stop dominate, like I've showed in this example with the Porsche and the strut. Well, I just took. So there's this bump stop. The once it's on the shaft, it doesn't take a lot of load, doesn't take a lot of cornering movement before this thing is going to start to engage. And then now you're changing the dynamic that maybe on a smooth road was pretty good, but with this rebound bias, soft compression, stiff rebound, boom, now you're going into pitchville. And you get this unsettled relationship. And I think a lot of people can detect that the front end is sort of the problem if you're not liking that behavior. And again, aftermarket setups can often do very similar things. Aftermarket tends to just use more spring than the factory, but with the rear usually, unless they're purposely creating flat ride because they know what they're doing or they just got lucky, better to be lucky than good, but it's nice if you're both. I think it's beneficial to know what you're doing instead of just closing your eyes and I hope I hit the dartboard. So the rear spring often in aftermarket is softer, or the frequency is lower than the front, so you get pitch. So you're trading pitch for pitch, two different ways of getting pitch, but you still end up with this front bias. As I mentioned in the previous video, talking about Corey and Max, and also a gentleman named Ryan with an E36 M3 who actually had MCS two ways, and then he upgraded. He thought he was upgrading to three ways. He did get three-way adjustables, meaning an external reservoir. That reservoir, you can put that in your engine bay, you can put it in your trunk, and blah blah blah. It's like, oh my god, that's a whole nother video too. What a pain. High speed pressure spikes, just for many other problems, but they were getting this chatter, they couldn't make it work right. So the sense of what's dominating, this is again the factory idea, the aftermarket, unless somebody's very very intentional. And I mean, like Rieger suspension, which maybe some people know about. I've only seen photos, I've heard things. I mean, a rally car suspension that's purposely to go and make the car work off-road. And I have a video talking about rally shocks, which I'll probably link to as well. I have probably a limit of how many cards, but I'll put links in the description so you can go jump to each of these. Part of making these videos is try to put all the pieces together so that someone can use that. Okay, jump here, look at this. So it's kind of somewhat sequential. But that company seems to do some really cool stuff. And I mean, one of my dreams personally is to be able to tune my own WRC suspension, to just have shafts, have bodies made, or to use an existing platform, and just go to town. You know, like it would just be so cool, because to me that's again like a penultimate level of racing, is like off-road, rally, you know, Baja, all that madness, all that wonderful stuff. It's great to be on track, and there's our own considerations with that too. That there's just something so satisfying about knowing you can bomb down a road and the car's going to take it. You know, even if you're not actually catching yumps, but just that's kind of what I've dialed into Christina a bit more now than I've had in the past. And if I've also mentioned, if anyone wants a ride, and if you're adult enough, and if I trust you, if we have a good vibe off of you, then you could potentially even, you know, get behind the wheel and drive her yourself to it, like 6'10", 7'10" level. You know, traction control stays on. But so with the FCM approach, with the FCM Elite approach, the idea of what's going to dominate is this rear spring, this rear frequency. Instead of being this front bias, we're going to go with a bit more of a rear bias. You know, whether it's a comfort setup or a high performance or dual purpose or a race or track only setup, we're emphasizing this rear to really do what I call, I think it's probably time to erase things on the board, because I've been wanting to clarify things. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to keep the lower part. Okay. Proportion of stiffness. I talked about the proportioning. Remember that. This isn't so crazy when you think about how much sway bar the factory is using. 45% front bar contribution. Aftermarket, you put on a bigger front bar. Please don't put on a bigger rear unless we talk, or, you know, unless you really know what you're doing. But you want to go with a stiffer rear spring more than you want just a stiffer rear bar. Okay, so this. Let's see here. Need a little bit more. Yeah, that's reasonable. Okay. I'll leave the pressure force equals pressure times area up. Well, this is a little bit cleaner. Okay. Is a concept that as I was taking notes for this video. In fact, let me just stop this as a reflection and I'll start another video.